We will now discuss economic reforms under the coalition politics. Economic reforms, especially in India, refer to new liberal policies implemented by Narasimha Rao government in 1991, when India was experiencing a severe economic crisis as a result of external debt. The revenues generated by the government were insufficient to cover the expenses. As a result, it was forced to borrow heavily from foreign banks in order to repay the debt. So, one of the first steps taken by this coalition government was liberalization. Liberalization was conceived with the idea that any regulation or restriction imposed by free trade must be relaxed in order for trade to take place. It enabled the opening of economic borders to foreign investments and multinational companies. Several economic reforms were imposed as a part of liberalization, including expansion of production capacity and deservicing of producing areas, the abolition of government industrial licensing, and freedom to import goods. The other step which was taken was privatization. Privatization refers to giving the private sector more opportunities to regulate various services while reducing the role of public sector, government owned enterprises, also known as that. Foreign direct investment was introduced in India with privatization and providing healthy competition to Indian goods and services. Globalization is another feature which the coalition politics is often against. So, what is meant by globalization? It refers to integration of Indian economy into the global economy in the context of economic reforms. It means that Indian economy will be dependent on global economy and vice versa. It promotes foreign direct investment, foreign trade with various countries. So, what were the features of the new economic conditions in India with the onset of liberalization policy introduced by coalition politics in 1991? Economic reforms were defined as policy changes aimed at improving the country's economic efficiency and rather than eradicating other issues like unemployment or equity growth. So, the major highlights of India's economic reforms included the service sector expanded, while the agriculture sector declined and the industrial sector fluctuated. The opening of Indian economy resulted in significant increase in FDI and foreign exchange reserves. Foreign institutional investments and direct investments were included in the category. During the reform period, India was a successful exporter of engineering goods, auto parts, IT software, and textiles. Prices increased. Prices increase was kept under control during the reforms. However, the major failures of Indian economic reforms include that the agriculture sector was neglected and public investment in the sector was reduced. Subsidies on fertilizers were removed, resulting in an increase in production cost that impacted many marginal and small farmers. Further, many policies were implemented that reduced import duties on agricultural products, lowered the minimum support price, increased the threat of international organizations competing with local farmers. Industrial sector grew in an uneven manner. As a result of the low cost of imports, demand for industrial goods decreased. Globalization, which allowed for free trade between countries, had a negative impact on local industry and as a result of job opportunities. Economic colonialism increased as a result of reforms. It also resulted in deterioration of culture. Many infrastructure investments such as power supply were insufficient. So, what were the objectives of the new economic policy? The new economic policy goal was to reduce inflation rates and accumulate sufficient foreign currency reserves in order to boost country's economic growth rate. Main goal was to bring the Indian economy into globalization arena and provided with a new market direction. Its goal was economic stability and market economy by eliminating all unnecessary regulations. It urged private actors in all sectors of the economy to become more involved. As a result, number of people working in reserved government sector decreased. It aimed to enable global movement of products, services, capital, people, resources, and technology without any constraint. So, July 2021 marks the 30th anniversary of the economic liberalization in India. The liberalization, which began in 1991 with Dr. Manmohan Singh as then finance minister in the Congress led coalition government, headed by P.V. Narasimha Rao. Much of the popular discussions commemorating the reforms in 1991 centered around the balance of payment crisis that triggered it, the economic reforms that followed, and the people who undertook it. What is usually lost in the political context that made the reforms possible and sustained in the economic trajectory over the next few decades. India has come a long way since then. In 1980s, the economic growth rate averaged barely around 5%. In contrast, under few years, India was seriously looking at prospect of a double-digit growth rate. So, therefore, if you really see, coalition government has been largely instrumental in introducing a very dramatic change in the Indian sector. But coalition reforms are not very easy to actually undertake. It was largely after the re-election in 1999 that Vajpayee-led coalition government resurrected the economic reforms agenda, and this approach of change, while claiming continuity, lowered the political temperature and drew many to relook and review the significance of economic liberalization in 1991. It was helped in no measure by visible changes in the economy and increasing growth rate set up in by then. Again, what makes the political context of economic reforms really interesting between 1989 and 2014 is that India had coalition governments at national level, which were often large and unwieldy. The politics was factious and wider society factored along ethnic, linguistic, caste, religious lines. Yet, there remained a surprising degree of continuity in economic policies and general thrust on reforms. In retrospective, it seems that politicians were forced to look for policies that improve economic performance only when they find that their own political survival is at stake. Throughout the first decade of 21st century, in addition to the emotive social agendas, most major political leaders also competed on promises to deliver high economic growth. This was sometimes that was unheard in India. The real lesson from India's economic reforms is that political competition creates the conditions where economic reforms become possible, which improves economic growth. Coalition politics requires negotiations that produce wider buy-in for reforms, while checking the arbitrary use of political power that may put a coalition partner at disadvantage. This is in sharp contrast to the popular belief that hard economic decisions can only be taken by a strong political leader with a stable legislative majority. What this analysis also suggests is that when political competition is high, the growth rate tends to move higher. It is needless to say that the economy is a very complex animal and does not move on linear trajectory. Well-intentioned autocrats are often cited as drivers of economic growth. Instead, market functions and participants flourish when trade is open and competition is intense. Regulations are right and predictable. Therefore, as discussed, economic reform in coalition politics requires that the monopolies which tend to capture the regulators and disrupt the efficiencies of the market need to be set aside. Political dominance is no assurance for economic reforms. Indeed, political dominance may make economic reforms redundant since economic performance is no longer among the key determinants of electoral success. So, what are the elements of coalition government? One, it is large and unwieldy. Why it is large? Because many parties come into play. They come together. They are of conflicting philosophies and therefore very difficult to rule by, very difficult to gain a buy in. There is factious politics since every philosophy is different. So, therefore, the political consensus is very difficult to arrive at. The politicians are forced to look for policies that improve economic performance only and only when their own political survival is at stake. Coalition politics requires negotiations that produce wider buy-in for reforms. So that means what? That means that a government, a prime minister has to make a greater effort to reach widely amongst its audience for any kind of economic reform. The coalition government also has the characteristic of having high political competition and this growth rate tends to move higher